The phone call came late, the sound of her voice sharp as glass. "We're leaving tomorrow, Dad. I already sold your beach house." Still, I didn't react, my hand clenched around the phone, fingers cold against the plastic. As her words hung in the air, the faint smell of saltwater from the old porch lingered in my mind, a reminder of everything she was throwing away. While I sat there, her betrayal cut deeper than I'd imagined. That's when I realized I'd let her think she could take everything, but not this, not my legacy. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Tom Caldwell sat on the weathered porch of his beach house, the damp early morning air wrapped around him like a thick, humid blanket. The marshes stretched out before him, a sprawling sea of greens and browns, the slow-moving water mirroring the pale sky above. The only sounds were the soft rustle of tall grasses and the distant call of an osprey. He breathed in deeply, savoring the quiet, his little piece of peace after years of noise. The coffee in his hand steamed gently, its warmth comforting against the slight chill in the air. He had been a widower for over a decade now, but the beach house, passed down from his grandfather, still felt like a living presence, holding memories of a family long gone. It was the last link to his past, to his wife, to everything he had worked for. And now, the future felt distant, almost out of reach. His daughter, Emily, had been distant too. Over the years, he'd noticed the way her calls had grown more infrequent, her visits even rarer. But today, he thought, maybe it was time to reach out. The phone in his pocket buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. The screen flashed with Emily's name. His thumb hovered for a moment, and then he answered. "Hello? Dad?" Her voice came through the line, sharp and quick, like she was reading from a script. "Mark and I are moving to Miami." Tom's grip tightened around his mug, but he forced a smile, despite the knot that tightened in his chest. "Miami, huh? That's big news. I didn't think you'd be—" "We're leaving tomorrow," Emily cut him off. There was a chill in her tone, no room for small talk, no warmth. She wasn't asking for his blessing, only delivering facts. Tom leaned back in the chair, trying to steady his thoughts. Miami? It made sense in a way. Mark had always been the ambitious one. Emily, on the other hand, had always been more practical, or at least she had been once. Now it seemed she was just chasing something, chasing success, chasing Mark. "Tomorrow, huh?" He let the silence hang for a moment before adding, his voice steady but laced with worry. "That's fast. Are you sure about this?" There was a pause on the other end, a brief flicker of hesitation. Then she spoke again, colder this time. "It's what we need, Dad. We need to get ahead, and—" She hesitated for just a beat. "I already sold your beach house." Tom felt his heart skip, a cold shock running through him. His hand trembled, the coffee mug rattling against the wooden railing. He could hardly process the words. "Sold?" he echoed, his voice thin with disbelief. "Yeah, we needed the cash," she said flatly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "It was just sitting there. Mark says we can do a lot more with that money than hold on to an old house. It was time to let go." His breath caught in his throat. Time to let go. It was more than just a house. It was the last piece of his family's legacy. His mind scrambled for words, for some kind of response, but nothing came. He had thought Emily would understand. She had always known how much this place meant to him. And yet, here she was, selling it off, with barely a second thought. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. He couldn't find his voice, couldn't find any words to describe the surge of betrayal flooding his chest. This wasn't just about the house, it was about her, about them. Before he could manage a single syllable, he heard the click of the phone call ending. The line went dead. Tom sat there in stunned silence, the mug still gripped in his hand, the warmth of the coffee long forgotten. The call had ended abruptly, just like that. No explanation, no apology. Just gone. He stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. He had built everything he had from the ground up. This house was a part of him, of his history, of his family's history. It was more than just a building. It was a symbol of everything they had worked for. And now, just like that, it was gone. Sold to strangers he didn't even know. A wave of anger washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by something deeper: grief, a sense of loss that wasn't just about the house. It was the loss of trust, the loss of connection, the loss of something he couldn't get back. And the worst part, he knew he couldn't undo what had been done. He couldn't call her back. He couldn't fix it with a simple conversation. Emily had made her choice, and now he would have to figure out what came next. He took a slow, deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He needed to think. He needed to do something. But what? What could he do now? The house was gone, and yet, somehow, the fight had just begun. Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the familiar road that led to the beach house. The tires of his old truck hummed steadily against the asphalt, but inside, his thoughts were anything but steady. The phone call had been a shock, a slap to the face that he was still trying to shake off. His daughter, Emily, had sold the house, without asking, without even considering how it would feel for him. The house was more than just a building. It was his history, his anchor. It was where his wife had spent their summers, where his children had grown up, where every corner held a memory. The drive felt longer than usual, the distance between him and the beach house suddenly feeling like miles instead of minutes. He tried to focus on the road, but the image of Emily's cold voice, her distant tone when she told him about the sale, kept replaying in his mind. She didn't even hesitate. She didn't care. And that hurt more than anything. When he finally turned onto the gravel driveway, he saw her SUV parked in front of the house. For a moment, he almost thought it was just a bad dream. Maybe he had misheard. Maybe there had been a mistake. But as his truck came to a stop, the reality set in. The front door was wide open, and inside, strangers were walking through the rooms, their voices echoing through the house. A couple of them were standing in the living room, examining the walls, as if they were already imagining their lives in the space that had once been his. Tom's chest tightened. This wasn't just a visit. This was the house being stripped away, piece by piece, in front of his eyes. A real estate agent, a younger woman in a blazer and heels, noticed him standing in the driveway. She smiled at him, almost too cheerfully, and waved as though it was all perfectly normal. "Inspection day," she called out, her voice high-pitched, too bright. Tom didn't respond. He couldn't. His heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline rising as he felt a mix of anger and disbelief. He was frozen for a second, as if he was watching someone else's life unfold before him. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. Not with Emily's approval. He took a slow breath and stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under his boots. Each step felt heavier than the last as he walked toward the house. He wasn't going to scream. He wasn't going to make a scene. He had to keep his composure. He had to. He had to remember who he was, who he had always been. Calm, steady, not the kind of man who let emotions rule his actions. But as he passed the front porch and moved toward the door, he saw her, Emily. She was standing by the steps, arms crossed, looking like she was bracing for something. She didn't even meet his eyes at first, and for a long moment, they just stood there in silence, the weight of everything hanging between them. "Dad," she finally spoke, her voice tight, defensive. "I didn't expect you to show up here." Tom's throat was dry. His words stuck. He wanted to yell, wanted to ask her how she could do this, how she could make such a cold, calculating decision without considering him for even a second. But instead, he simply asked, "Why?" Emily's gaze flickered for a moment, guilt flashing behind her eyes, but it was quickly masked by a veneer of indifference. "We needed liquidity," she said, her voice flat, as though it was the simplest answer in the world. "We've been struggling. Mark and I can't keep up with the lifestyle we want without it." "Mark." Tom's eyes shifted slightly as he saw him standing just behind Emily, leaning against the porch railing with a smirk on his face. Mark didn't even try to hide the arrogance in his expression. He didn't even pretend to care. You weren't using the place anyway, he chimed in, as though it was a perfectly valid excuse. Tom's blood boiled at the casual dismissal. You weren't using the place anyway. Of course, that's how Mark saw it. A financial asset, nothing more. But to Tom, this wasn't just a place. It was everything. His fists clenched at his sides, but he took another slow breath. I was using it, he said quietly, his voice controlled. I still am. But that's not the point. Emily's eyes hardened, and for a split second, Tom saw something in her he hadn't expected. Guilt. It flickered across her face before it vanished, replaced by the same cold, pragmatic expression she had worn since the beginning. He didn't say anything else. There was nothing more to say. The damage had been done. The house was gone. The trust, his legacy, was gone, and he couldn't bring it back with a single word. Without another glance, Tom turned on his heel and walked back toward his truck. He didn't look back. He couldn't. As the sound of his boots faded on the gravel, Emily called after him, but he didn't stop. He knew there was nothing left to say. The house was already sold, and soon, so much more would be gone too. He climbed into his truck, starting the engine, but his mind was still racing. What now? What was he supposed to do next? He had to act fast. Time was slipping away, and all the while, in the back of his mind, the question gnawed at him. How could she do this to me? The drive back from the beach house was a blur. Tom didn't remember much of the road, the turns, or the trees that lined the highway, like silent witnesses to his anger. His mind kept replaying the conversation, the coldness in Emily's voice, the finality of her words. We needed liquidity. We needed the cash. There was no room for sentiment, no place for the history that had been built here. By the time he reached his house, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in muted purples and reds. He parked the truck in the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the empty street, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He didn't know what to do next. The house was gone, sold without his consent, and Emily had betrayed him in a way he couldn't quite comprehend yet. The silence of the night felt suffocating. He grabbed the keys from the ignition, his fingers cold and stiff, and stepped out of the truck. The front door creaked as he opened it, the familiar smell of his house, dust, wood, the faint scent of leather, filling his nose. It should have been comforting. But it only reminded him that everything was changing, that nothing was as it seemed anymore. Tom walked into the living room, his boots heavy on the hardwood floors. His eyes instinctively moved toward the small desk in the corner where he kept a collection of old files, papers, and receipts from years past. There were some things he had always kept, things he couldn't let go of, even after everything had shifted in his life. He wasn't a sentimental man, not in the way Emily had been, but there were things, papers, documents, that he believed held answers. And answers, right now, were the only thing that mattered. He sat at the desk and flipped open the top drawer. The rustle of old papers filled the room, but the real weight was in his chest. His fingers moved across the clutter, pushing aside a stack of old fishing licenses, insurance forms, and tax returns, until they landed on a worn, leather-bound file. The label was faint, but he knew what it was before even opening it. Caldwell Family Trust. He hadn't looked at it in years. It had always been a kind of formality, a thing he kept in the back of his mind but never really thought about. The trust had been established when his grandfather had died, a safeguard for the property, for the family legacy, for the beach house. With a soft exhale, he opened the file. His eyes scanned the old documents, the signatures, the official stamps, the legal jargon that had always felt so distant to him. But then, his gaze froze on something that made his blood run cold. He slid a paper out, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he read the text that confirmed it. The beach house, the one Emily had just sold, was never titled under his name. It wasn't owned by him at all. It was owned by the Caldwell Family Trust. He swallowed, the realization settling like a stone in his stomach. Emily had no idea. She thought she was selling something that belonged to him, but it was never his to sell. It wasn't even in her hands legally. It was a part of something bigger, something she wasn't a beneficiary of. His breath caught in his throat. You sold a house you never owned, he whispered to himself, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. His fingers clenched the paper, the truth unfolding like a sharp blade. All this time, she had never known the full extent of the family's holdings, the true ownership. She had thought it was simple, just an old house, but the trust, Tom's grandfather's foresight, had protected it. And now, with a single signature, Emily had sold a legacy she wasn't even part of. Anger surged inside him, but it wasn't the same kind of rage he had felt earlier. This was different. This was the kind of fury that came from realizing how deep the betrayal ran. It wasn't just a financial mistake. It was a misunderstanding of who held the power, of what this family had built. Emily hadn't just lost the house. She had lost the right to claim it. His hand trembled as he reached for the phone on the desk. He dialed the number he knew by heart, the number that had been his lifeline during legal battles and family disputes for years. Mr. Whitmore, his attorney, his friend. The line rang twice before Whitmore's voice answered, gruff and steady as always. Tom? Whitmore. Tom's voice was low, barely above a whisper, but filled with a quiet fury. You need to come over. Now. There was a pause on the other end, a slight intake of breath, but no questions. Whitmore knew the weight in Tom's voice, knew the gravity of the situation. I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said, no hesitation. Tom hung up, his heart still pounding. The pieces were falling into place, but there was something else now, a new kind of determination, a need to make sure Emily understood what she had done, to show her that this wasn't just about money. This was about family, heritage. It wasn't something you could sell off without consequences. Tom stared at the papers one last time, the dim light casting shadows over the faded ink. He wasn't going to let her get away with this, not without a fight. And as the sound of a distant car engine rumbled in the driveway, he knew it was only the beginning. The battle had just started, and he wasn't backing down. The sun had dipped lower in the sky by the time Whitmore arrived, his car pulling into the gravel driveway with a soft crunch. Tom had been pacing back and forth on the porch, his mind heavy with the weight of the day, the betrayal, the shock. His thoughts swirled like a storm he couldn't outrun. How had it all gone so wrong? How had Emily, his own daughter, made such a reckless decision? The house was more than just property. It was the last part of his family he had left, and she had sold it without a second thought. The steady rhythm of Whitmore's boots on the porch steps snapped him back to reality. The old man looked the same as always, stoic, weathered, his leather briefcase hanging loosely from his hand. Whitmore was a man who had seen too much of life's grim side to be easily shaken. But Tom noticed the slight furrow in his brow as he stepped up onto the porch. He knew it wasn't the first time Whitmore had seen someone act with reckless disregard for family legacy, but that didn't make it easier. "Evening, Tom," Whitmore greeted, his voice as steady as ever. He set his briefcase on the porch and unlatched it with the quiet precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times. There was no small talk, no attempt at pleasantries, just business. And for now, that was what Tom needed. "Evening," Tom muttered, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He took a seat on the rocking chair and tried to steady his breathing, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. He couldn't push it down completely. Not yet. Whitmore sat across from him, pulling out a few sheets of paper from his briefcase. The edges crisp and perfectly aligned, he spread them out on the small table between them. "These are the listing documents Emily used to sell the house," Whitmore said, tapping the pages. His tone was neutral, but Tom could hear the edge of disapproval. "The signatures, the representations she made to the buyers, it's all here." Tom leaned forward, his gaze scanning the documents with a sense of growing disbelief. The neatness of it all, the signatures, the official stamps. It was so clean on paper, but the deeper he looked, the more the lie became apparent. It was all built on a foundation of misrepresentation. Emily had signed off on everything, thinking she had the right to sell, but she didn't. She never had. The house was held in the Caldwell family trust, and Emily was not a beneficiary. Her signature, the one that made this all happen, had been nothing more than a mistake, or worse, a deliberate move to seize control. "This is fraud," Whitmore said, his voice sharp now, a quiet anger seeping through the calm exterior. Unauthorized transaction, misrepresentation. This isn't a minor mistake, Tom. This is serious. Tom's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of those words pressing down on him, the reality of the situation beginning to settle in. Fraud. That was the word. His daughter, his own flesh and blood, had crossed a line that couldn't be undone with an apology. She hadn't just sold property, she had sold a legacy. His legacy. His throat went dry. She's still my daughter, Tom whispered, more to himself than to Whitmore. The pain of it, of seeing Emily so consumed by ambition, by the life she had built with Mark, was unbearable. He had raised her. He had loved her. But now, he wasn't sure who she was anymore. Whitmore's eyes softened, just slightly, though his tone remained firm. Then let's teach her, not crush her, he said, leaning back in his chair. There was no judgment in his words, just a quiet, determined understanding. She's made a mistake, Tom, a big one, but she's still your daughter. We don't need to destroy her life. We need to help her understand what she's done. Tom's eyes drifted to the horizon, where the last light of the day had faded, leaving only the shadow of the trees against a darkening sky. There was a part of him that wanted to go after her, to scream at her, to make her see the gravity of what she had done. But another part of him, the part that had always tried to be steady, to be calm, knew that wasn't the way. Not this time. He looked down at the papers Whitmore had laid out before him, the legal documents, the steps to undo the damage Emily had caused. There were options. There was a way to freeze the sale, to stop it from going any further. It wasn't over yet. Tom reached for the pen Whitmore had placed beside the documents, his fingers brushing the smooth surface. The weight of it felt immense in his hand. His breath hitched as he signed the preliminary paperwork that would trigger the legal freeze on the sale. The weight of the pen, the click of the paper as it moved beneath his hand, it all felt too final, too cold. This wasn't just a legal move. This was the beginning of something that couldn't be undone, the beginning of a battle he hadn't wanted, but had no choice but to fight. Whitmore nodded as Tom signed the last line, his expression unreadable but approving. Good, he said quietly. We'll move forward carefully. No confrontation, not yet. But we'll stop the sale. We'll stop her. Tom's jaw tightened as he leaned back in his chair, his heart still pounding. He didn't know what would come next, what it would cost him to get through this. But one thing was clear. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything he had lost. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and uncertain. And somewhere in the depths of his chest, Tom felt the first stirrings of something far worse than anger. A quiet, growing sense of loss. His daughter had betrayed him. But now, it was time to make sure she understood just how deep that betrayal ran. The legal battle was only the beginning. The restaurant was sleek, polished, a world away from the familiar worn wooden tables of Tom's house. Every surface gleamed with perfection, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the marble floors. The air smelled faintly of expensive wine and seafood, the clink of silverware against porcelain plates punctuating the quiet hum of conversation. Tom couldn't help but feel out of place. This wasn't his world. His world was the beach house, the simple quiet of his porch overlooking the marshlands. This place, with its glistening chandeliers and sharp, angular decor, felt like a foreign country. He had never been much for fine dining. He liked his meals straightforward, no fuss, just a plate of meat and potatoes, maybe a cold beer to wash it down. But tonight, he was here on Emily's invitation. She had asked, no, insisted he come. We need to talk, Dad. You need to hear what's going on. You're going to want to hear this. That's what she had said over the phone. Her voice had been almost too calm, as if nothing was wrong. But Tom knew better. He knew this dinner wasn't going to be about explanations. It was going to be about justifying her actions, dressing up betrayal in fancy words. As he stepped inside, he saw them, Mark and his parents, seated at a table near the back. Mark's parents sat with their backs straight, eyes sharp, as if every movement and word could be scrutinized and weighed. Tom wasn't surprised. They had always looked down on him, even when Emily was young, even when he was just a simple boat mechanic trying to make a living. To them, Tom was an afterthought, a relic of the past. "Tom!" Mark's voice rang out too loudly, breaking the silence. He stood, a little too eagerly, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Glad you could make it." Tom nodded and sat down, his body stiff in the plush chair. Emily wasn't looking at him. She sat across the table, her posture perfect, her eyes trained on her plate, but never quite meeting his gaze. She had always been the one to stand up for herself, to speak her mind, but tonight she seemed small. There was a distance between them, an unspoken wall that neither of them knew how to break down. Mark slid into his seat beside her, leaning back like a king in his throne. He ordered wine for the table without asking, and Tom, despite himself, felt the bitterness rise in his throat. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about Emily choosing a life with Mark, one that didn't include the values Tom had tried to instill in her. This was about a decision that had been made without him, without the respect for the legacy he had worked for. "So, Tom," Mark began, his voice smooth as velvet, but with an undercurrent of smugness that Tom could already feel crawling under his skin. "We've been making some big moves lately, unlocking stuck generational assets, as I like to say." He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Selling off that old beach house was just the beginning. We're opening new doors now, big ones. Tom stared at him for a long moment, but said nothing. He felt the anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to keep his calm. His fingers tightened around the stem of his wineglass, but he did not take a sip. "Sounds like you've got it all figured out," he said coolly, his voice low. Emily finally lifted her eyes from her plate. But there was no apology in them, no remorse. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but it wasn't the kind of discomfort that made her regret her actions. It was the kind that came from knowing she was caught between two worlds. Her father, who was slowly becoming a ghost in her life, and Mark, who had always been the future. Her future, the one she had chosen. "I just thought," Emily began, her voice trailing off. She cleared her throat, as if the words weren't coming out the way she had intended. But then she fell silent again, avoiding his eyes like they were made of glass. She wasn't going to explain. She wasn't going to make him understand. The silence dragged on as Mark picked up the conversation, speaking with such ease that it was almost suffocating. "Don't worry about it, Tom. It's all in the past now. We've got bigger plans." "And Emily? She's adapted. She's made the smart choice." Tom's jaw clenched. "Smart?" he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "If selling that house was so smart, why does it feel like you've already taken everything else too?" Mark leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with that same calculating glint Tom had seen in him from the start. "Because you weren't using the place anyway," he said, shrugging like it was no big deal. "It's not like you were going to pass it down to anyone. We figured it was better off in the hands of someone who knows how to make it work." Tom's chest tightened with a mix of disbelief and hurt. He could feel the sting of betrayal deep in his bones. He had built that house with his own hands, poured every ounce of his sweat and blood into it. And now, here was Mark, sitting across from him, talking like it was just some old asset, something to be moved around like a piece of furniture. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat and pushed his plate away slightly. His hand trembled, but he kept his voice even. "I hope it works out for you," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than he wanted to admit. Mark's smirk only deepened. "It already has," he said, with a finality that made Tom's skin crawl. Tom's eyes hardened as he stared at him. The weight of everything he had lost in that moment, the house, his daughter's respect, his place in her life, pressed down on him like a storm cloud. But he wasn't done. Not yet. "Not yet," he replied, his voice steady but cold, as he locked eyes with Emily, who finally looked up at him, her face unreadable. "Not until I say so." And for the first time, Tom realized this wasn't just a fight over property. This was about the soul of his family, and he wasn't going to let it slip away without a fight. The dinner ended with silence hanging between them, heavy and unresolved. The morning had barely broken when Whitmore arrived at Tom's house with a briefcase in hand, his face set in a grim, unreadable expression. Tom had been waiting, sitting at the kitchen table, his fingers tapping against the coffee cup, every minute stretching out longer than the last. The initial shock had worn off, but the anger, raw and quiet, remained, simmering beneath his calm exterior. He'd been patient, biding his time, but now was the moment to act. Now it was time to stop Emily's reckless decision. The house wasn't just hers to sell. It had never been hers to begin with. "Morning, Tom," Whitmore said as he stepped inside, his voice low but firm. He didn't wait for small talk. The legal documents in his hand were all that mattered. "I've filed the injunction," he continued, laying the papers down with precise movement, his eyes locking onto Tom's. "It's in motion. The sale won't close now, not unless they can prove the transfer was valid." Tom nodded, the smallest sense of relief washing over him. This wasn't over, not yet, but it was a start. "Good," he said, his voice steady but tight with the weight of everything that had happened. "Good." Whitmore slid the documents across the table, giving Tom one last look before standing up. "I'll monitor the situation from here. I expect Mark's real estate agent to be calling you soon, but be prepared. They won't let this go quietly." As Whitmore left, Tom sat for a moment longer, the quiet of the house enveloping him. It was a strange kind of stillness, the calm before the storm. He knew that the moment Mark found out, there would be hell to pay. He could already feel the tension rising in the pit of his stomach, but there was no turning back now. Emily had made her choice, and now Tom would make his. As predicted, just a few hours later, Tom's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but he knew immediately who it was. He picked up without hesitation, his voice cool but alert. "This is Tom." "Mr. Caldwell," came the panicked voice of the real estate agent. "We've hit a snag. We've received a legal notice. There's an injunction. You filed it?" Tom could hear the rapid breathing on the other end of the line, the agent clearly flustered. He didn't offer any reassurances. "Yes," he replied flatly. "The sale is frozen until further notice." The line crackled with the sounds of the agent's frustration. "But this is a legal issue we can't ignore, Mr. Caldwell. This will derail everything. The buyers have already made plans. They've secured financing." "You should have thought of that before you listed a house that wasn't yours to sell," Tom cut in, his voice low but firm. There was a sharp exhale on the other end, followed by a brief silence before the agent spoke again, this time with a different edge to their voice. "I'll need to inform Mr. Warren immediately. This is bad, Mr. Caldwell." "I'm sure he knows," Tom replied quietly. He hung up the phone before the agent could say anything more. He didn't need to hear any more excuses. The damage had been done, and now the battle would be fought in a different arena, the one that mattered. Tom stared out the window, his mind working. Emily was his daughter, but she'd made her decision, and he was not about to let her destroy everything their family had built, not without a fight. The doorbell rang a short while later. Tom opened it to find Rachel standing there, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the room. "What's going on, Dad?" she asked, her voice laced with a mix of anger and disbelief. Tom motioned toward the kitchen table, where the legal papers sat, their weight hanging heavy in the air. "Whitmore filed an injunction. The sale's on hold. We're not letting it close," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet fury. Rachel's eyes flicked down to the papers, then back up at him. "So, that's it? You're stopping her? You're really doing this?" Tom sighed, leaning against the counter, his fingers gripping the edge. "She sold the house without thinking," he said quietly, the words carrying a weight that made Rachel pause. Without understanding what it meant, she forgot who actually owned it. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, processing his words. Then her face tightened in frustration. How could she not know? How could she make such a huge decision without knowing? Her voice faltered, and she stopped herself, the weight of her own disbelief settling in. She thought she could sell it, Rachel. She thought it was hers to sell. Tom's voice dropped lower, the pain of the realization still fresh. She didn't care enough to find out who actually owned it. Rachel's eyes softened with a mixture of anger and sympathy. But she's still your daughter, Dad. I know that, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. But she made a choice. And now she has to face the consequences. Rachel crossed her arms, her face hardening with resolve. So, what now? You're going to drag this out? Tom met her gaze, his eyes dark with determination. I'm going to make sure she learns what happens when you make decisions without understanding the cost. She needs to know that there's more at stake here than just her dreams of a shiny new life. There was a long silence between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Rachel's expression softened, but the weight of what had just been set in motion hung heavy between them. Tom wasn't sure what came next, but one thing was certain. The fight had just begun, and it was far from over. The doorbell rang just after lunch, breaking the quiet of Tom's afternoon. He was sitting at the kitchen table, an old book open in front of him, though his mind wasn't on the words. It never truly left the situation with Emily. Every minute that passed since the injunction had been filed seemed to dig deeper into the silence between them. He had been hoping, praying, that she would come to her senses, but now, as the doorbell rang again, he knew she was coming, not to apologize, but to do something worse, to expect forgiveness. He stood slowly, placing the book down, and walked to the door. When he opened it, Emily stood there, her face guarded, a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She wore a sleek, expensive coat that only reinforced the distance between them, the distance that had been growing ever since she and Mark had come into his life with their grand plans. She wasn't here to make amends. She was here to fix things, but only in the way that suited her. Dad, she said, her voice almost too casual, like she hadn't just shattered everything with her decisions. I know we need to talk. I wanted to come by and explain. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't think it through. But you've got to understand, this is about moving forward. Tom didn't say anything right away. He just let the silence stretch out between them, his eyes steady on hers. She wanted forgiveness. He could see that much in her posture, in the way her hands were wringing the strap of her purse. But forgiveness wasn't something he could give her, not just yet. Emily stepped inside, glancing around as if the house might have changed in the time since her last visit, which had been too long ago. I'm sure we can work this out, she added, her voice softer now, as if she were testing the waters, trying to gauge his mood. But Tom stayed silent, watching her, waiting for her to say what she had really come to say. It's just a property, Dad, Emily continued, her tone now laced with a kind of dismissive calm. You weren't using it. It was sitting there. It's not like it was a part of your life anymore. Tom's jaw tightened, but he kept his face unreadable. It was hard not to feel the sting of her words, but he didn't let her see the anger burning just beneath the surface. Emily had always been pragmatic, but this was something different. It wasn't just business to her. It was a way to wash her hands of everything she didn't understand. Rachel stepped into the room just as Emily finished speaking, her arms crossed, her face full of disbelief. She had been quiet until now, but this was too much. It was Mom's favorite place, she shot back, her voice rising, sharp with emotion. That place wasn't just some investment. It meant something. Emily turned, her eyes flicking to Rachel for the briefest moment, before she shrugged dismissively. Sentiment doesn't pay bills, Rachel, she said coolly, as if that was the only explanation needed. She made a small motion with her hand, like she was swatting away an irritating fly. We all have to be realistic here. Rachel's nostrils flared, her anger flaring like a spark in dry brush. She took a step forward, but Tom placed a hand on her arm, steadying her. The last thing he needed was to lose his temper in front of Emily. The damage had already been done. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator, the stillness hanging in the air like a suspended breath. Tom kept his gaze fixed on Emily, his expression calm, yet the hurt in his chest was undeniable. His mind flashed back to the years spent with his wife, the summers spent at that beach house, the laughter, the memories. And now, Emily, his own daughter, had turned it into a transaction, something to be bought and sold like a piece of furniture. You've made your choice, Emily, Tom said quietly, his voice even, his control slipping just enough to let her hear the weight of the disappointment in his words. And I can't change that for you. Emily's face softened, and she took a step toward him, the faintest trace of desperation in her eyes. Dad, please, she said, her voice quieter now, tinged with something that felt like regret. I just need you to sign these closing documents for the bank. It's the last thing. Once you sign, everything will be done, and then we can move forward. We can fix this. She held out the papers to him, the weight of her request hanging in the air between them. Tom didn't take them immediately. He studied the documents in her hand, his fingers curling into his palm. The house, their family's legacy, wasn't something to just move past. He couldn't let it go, not like this. Finally, without a word, Tom took the papers from her. He didn't look at her, didn't offer her the reassurance she wanted. He just held the documents in his hands, offering no reaction. Emily's eyes searched his face for any sign of softness, but he remained unreadable, quiet, calm. For a moment, Emily stood there, waiting for him to do something, anything, but Tom didn't give her the satisfaction. He wasn't going to let her think that this could be resolved with a simple signature, not after everything that had happened. He glanced at Rachel, who stood silently in the corner, her arms still crossed, watching everything unfold. And for the first time in a long while, Tom felt a deep sense of clarity. This wasn't about getting the house back or making Emily see the error of her ways. This was about making sure she understood the consequences of what she had done. The rest could wait, but not this. Tom finally spoke, his voice calm but unwavering. We'll see what happens next, Emily, but don't expect this to be over just because you want it to be. The words hung in the air between them, unresolved, as Emily's face darkened, the tension between them stretching taut. The morning air at the beach house was thick with humidity. The smell of saltwater carried on the breeze. Tom had barely slept the night before, his mind spinning with the consequences of Emily's actions. And now, as he sat in his truck, parked across the street, he could see the buyer's car pull into the driveway. A dark, luxury sedan, shiny and pristine, just like everything Emily had worked so hard to cultivate in her life. Perfect on the surface, but hollow underneath. The buyers were coming for their walkthrough, the final step in what should have been a smooth, lucrative sale. Instead, it was about to turn into a nightmare. Tom's jaw tightened as he saw them step out of the car. Two sharply dressed professionals, eager to move in, unaware that the deal they'd been sold was built on lies. He hadn't wanted to be here, but Whitmore had insisted. If this was going to get resolved, it had to be done right. And Whitmore, ever the experienced attorney, was the one who would have to break the news. As the buyers approached the front door, their real estate agent following close behind, they were greeted not by Emily or Mark, but by Whitmore, who stood on the porch with a somber expression. He wasn't here to sell anything. He was here to stop everything from falling apart. Mr. Whitmore? The male buyer, tall with a businesslike air, extended his hand, but the agent quickly cut him off, motioning for the buyers to hold back. Hold on, the agent said, his voice filled with a nervous energy. This isn't part of the plan. We're supposed to walk through, make sure everything's in order. Whitmore didn't shake his hand. He didn't even acknowledge the agent's hurried movements. His eyes were fixed on the buyers, steady and unflinching. I'm afraid the walkthrough is no longer going to happen. This property is no longer being sold. The words hung in the air like a cold gust of wind, cutting through the morning haze. The buyers froze, exchanging confused glances. What do you mean it's no longer being sold? The female buyer asked, her voice clipped, now laced with suspicion. We've already made our offer. We've got financing secured. Whitmore held up a hand, cutting her off with quiet authority. The seller had no right to sell the house, he explained, his voice steady and calm. The property was never in their name. It belonged to a trust, the Caldwell Family Trust. And Emily Caldwell, the seller, is not a beneficiary of that trust. She had no legal claim to it. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. The buyers exchanged looks, their faces hardening, the confusion quickly turning to frustration. The agent stepped forward, his hands raised defensively. Wait a second. This isn't what we were told. The sale was approved. The paperwork was signed. Whitmore's expression didn't change. That's right. You were misled. The signatures, the ownership, they were all a lie. The buyers were furious now, their faces flushed with anger. You mean to tell me, the male buyer began, his voice rising, that we've been walking around here making plans, thinking everything's set, and none of it's real. His hands were on his hips, his jaw clenched. And the agent... He turned to the real estate agent, who shrank back, clearly caught off guard. What do you have to say about this? The agent opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Instead, he looked back at Whitmore, then down at the ground, his shoulders sagging in defeat. I wasn't aware of the full details, he muttered, trying to sidestep the blame. I'm not the one who handled the paperwork. This is a misunderstanding. The buyers weren't having it. A misunderstanding? You've been representing this house for weeks, and now you're telling me it was all based on a lie? The female buyer was shaking her head in disbelief. I'm done. Get us out of here. They stormed off toward their car, leaving the agent standing there, speechless, fumbling for words that could never undo the damage done. As their car peeled out of the driveway, Tom felt a wave of grim satisfaction, though it was tainted by the underlying bitterness of what was unfolding. This was only the beginning. Whitmore turned to Tom, who had been watching from the truck across the street. It's done, Whitmore said quietly. We've stopped it. Tom nodded slowly but didn't feel relief. Not yet. This wasn't a victory. It was a battle won, but the war was far from over. Emily would never understand the magnitude of her actions until it was too late. Tom reached for his phone, the screen lighting up with a dozen missed calls and messages. Mark's name flashed repeatedly, angry texts, a string of voicemails that were nothing short of frantic. He didn't bother listening to them just yet. As the realtor began gathering his things, trying to regain some semblance of professionalism, the first phone call came in. It was Mark. Tom's thumb hovered over the screen, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the phone ring, knowing that Mark wouldn't stop until he'd vented his rage. A part of him, something deep inside, was almost looking forward to it. The mess had just begun, and it would take more than just legal documents to untangle this one. The calls, the fallout. It was all just a prelude to what was coming next. And Tom had no intention of backing down now. The phone rang early in the morning, the shrill tone cutting through the quiet of Tom's house. He reached for the receiver, half awake, but the name on the screen jolted him fully awake. It was Mark. Of course it was Mark. Tom answered with a slow, deliberate motion. What is it? He asked, trying to mask the edge in his voice. He knew what this was about. He'd been waiting for it, dreading it. He just hadn't expected it to come so soon. Your damn lawyer. Mark's voice exploded over the line, full of frustration and panic. He's ruined everything. The loan's been denied. The bank won't process the Miami condo because of that legal freeze. They say there's a cloud on the title. How the hell could you let this happen? Tom closed his eyes, feeling a small surge of vindication mixed with guilt. He had warned them. The house was never theirs to sell. But hearing Mark's voice crack with frustration, knowing this was just the beginning, made something heavy settle in his chest. Mark, I didn't do this, Tom replied, his voice quiet but firm. You're the one who pushed this deal through without understanding the ownership. I told you not to go forward. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then Mark's voice came back, colder, sharper than before. This is your fault. You're the one who's making this difficult, ruining everything. We were so close. We were about to have everything we wanted. Everything. Tom felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He could already hear it, the desperation in Mark's voice. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about Mark's dream, the one built on the false belief that everything was up for grabs. And now, the dream was crumbling. Mark, calm down, Tom started, but Mark cut him off. I'm not going to calm down, old man, Mark shouted. You've destroyed our future. You've cost me everything. Emily's given up her job. She's already told them she's leaving. And now this. You've ruined everything. The line went dead before Tom could respond. He stared at the phone in his hand, his pulse steady despite the sharp sting of anger that burned in his chest. Mark was right about one thing. Emily had given notice at work. He knew that much from her earlier texts. But to blame him for this, it was beyond the point of reason. He had warned them. He had tried to stop this from happening. As he sat there, the silence in the house pressing against him, the phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Emily. He stared at the screen, reading the words that burned through the glass. "You ruined everything." Tom didn't feel the urge to reply. Instead, he just let the message sit there, ignored. The words didn't hurt. They were just another reflection of how far she had fallen into Mark's world, a world of easy fixes and calculated moves. She had forgotten what it meant to respect what was theirs, what had been their families. He set the phone down, not bothering to check the new string of messages that followed. His focus shifted to the old boat sitting in the corner of the yard, the one he had been working on for years, a project that had kept him grounded through every storm life had thrown at him. It was something tangible, something that had never let him down. Rachel walked outside just then, carrying a tool bag, her face soft with concern. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice warm but edged with a knowing sadness. "You okay?" Tom didn't answer right away. He just stared at the boat, his fingers brushing against the worn wood. It was easier, somehow, to lose himself in the work. It was something solid in the face of all the chaos. The boat needed repairs, real, practical things, fixable things, things that didn't have to carry the weight of betrayal. Rachel squatted beside him, offering him a wrench. "Need a hand?" Tom took it without a word. The rhythmic sound of metal against metal filled the silence between them, as if it could drown out everything else. Rachel worked alongside him, trying to match his pace, but there was something else in her eyes, a quiet understanding that Tom didn't need to verbalize. "She built this disaster," Tom said finally, his voice rough. His hands moved with purpose, but his thoughts were elsewhere, drifting back to the heated exchange with Mark, back to Emily's cold, distant voice on the phone. Rachel didn't respond at first. She just handed him another tool, her hands steady. She didn't need to say anything. She knew exactly what he meant. Emily had done this to herself, and now the fallout was theirs to deal with. The tension in the air was palpable, but Tom pushed it away, focusing instead on the boat, on the rhythm of the repairs, the only thing he could control in this spiraling mess. But deep down, he knew there was no easy fix for the broken pieces that Emily had left behind. Not yet. And as the sun sank lower in the sky, Tom's mind wandered back to the phone and the unanswered texts. What would she do next? What would they all do when the dust finally settled? And the worst part, he didn't know if there was a way to repair what had been broken. Tom sat in the dim light of the kitchen, his hands resting on the papers spread out in front of him. The weight of the moment felt heavier than the ink on the page. Whitmore had just left after a final review of the documents, everything now clear and undeniable. Emily had tried to sell what wasn't hers to sell, using fraudulent documents, misrepresenting ownership. It was a betrayal that Tom couldn't quite wrap his mind around, but the facts were irrefutable. The fraud was real, the damage was done, and now it was time to finish it. Whitmore had done his part, gathering the necessary evidence, filing claims, and compiling everything they needed to show that Emily had overstepped, had acted without authority. But this was Tom's move now. This was his chance to take back what had been taken, to stop the lie from continuing. The papers in front of him were a mix of old family trust documents, legal statements, and Emily's fraudulent signatures. He had read through them all, each line confirming that she had known exactly what she was doing, but had pushed forward anyway, assuming she could get away with it. And now, there was no undoing the mistake. Not for her. The calm quiet of the house was shattered by the sound of the pen tapping against the wood. Tom exhaled slowly, as though trying to clear the weight of the decision before him. This wasn't just paperwork. This wasn't just a transaction. This was about family, about trust, things that Emily had taken for granted. He picked up the pen without hesitation, his hand steady as he signed the counterclaim. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't filled with fury or emotion. It was simple, final, and cold. The pen scratched against the paper, and the last of his patience, the last of his hope for a resolution without conflict, vanished in that one motion. He had done it. He had officially reasserted the trust's ownership of the beach house. Emily's attempt to sell it had failed, and there was no going back. Tom stared at the papers for a moment longer, the weight of what he had just signed settling on him. It was done. But the cost of this victory, was his daughter. That thought sat heavy in his chest, twisting with every breath he took. She had betrayed him, but even now, he couldn't shake the feeling of loss that lingered. The phone rang, dragging him out of his thoughts. It was Emily. He didn't answer it. Not yet. Instead, he looked at the clock. Minutes passed, and then the doorbell rang. A delivery. Nothing unusual. But when he opened it, it wasn't a package waiting for him. It was the legal notice from Whitmore, officially filed. The papers had been delivered to Emily, the counterclaims sent to her, just as they had planned. As Tom held the notice in his hand, he could already picture Emily's reaction. She had known this was coming, but the reality would hit differently. And it did. Her voice broke through the silence like glass shattering. Her screams pierced through the air even from across the street, carried on the wind as Tom stood at the door, still holding the notice. He heard her, then Mark's voice in the background, angry and desperate. "You told me he'd just sign it." Emily's voice cracked with fury. "You told me he'd be easy. He's ruined everything." Tom didn't need to hear more. He had expected this. Emily's anger wasn't new to him, but the rawness of it still stung. She had expected him to just roll over. But Tom wasn't that man. Not anymore. Mark's voice came through then, and it was cold, colder than Tom had ever heard it before. "Your father is the problem," Mark said, his words flat, dismissive. "He's the one standing in our way." For a long moment, Tom stood frozen on the porch, listening to the chaos unfold. The call ended abruptly, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. Emily had hoped, no, expected, that this would all blow over. She had assumed that her father would cave, that the pressure of the situation would break him, but he hadn't. Tom turned away from the door, the weight of the entire situation pressing down on him. He didn't have to hear the rest of their argument to know what was happening. Their marriage was cracking. This was more than just a dispute over property now. It was the fracture of everything they had built together. A quiet destruction of trust, of loyalty. In the back of his mind, Tom felt a bitter satisfaction, but it was a hollow one. Emily had made her choices, but so had Mark, and now they would both have to deal with the consequences. Tom moved into the kitchen, his hands trembling slightly as he set the papers down. His eyes lingered on them for a moment, before he turned his attention back to the boat in the yard, its hull waiting for repair. There was work to do. There always was. But something had shifted inside him. There was no going back from this now, and as he picked up the tools again, the sounds of their argument still echoing faintly through the open window, Tom knew that things had changed, that this was just the beginning. And Emily, she had just begun to realize how deep the damage went. The knock at the door came late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky. Tom had been in the garage, wiping down the boat, his hands thick with grease and oil. It was a task that kept his mind occupied, something he could do without thinking too hard about the chaos that had become his life. But when he heard the knock, he knew exactly who it was before he even opened the door. It was Emily. She stood there in the doorway, her eyes red, her makeup streaked down her face from tears. She looked smaller than he remembered, fragile, like someone who had been broken by their own actions. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking up at him with a mix of guilt and desperation. Tom said nothing either, just watched her for a long moment, his chest tightening with 1,000 conflicting emotions. Anger, hurt, the kind of quiet disappointment that gnawed at you even when you didn't speak. But still, he didn't move, didn't offer her any kind of welcome. This wasn't a visit. This wasn't an apology he had been waiting for. "Dad!" Her voice cracked, just the sound of it making his stomach turn. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and took a hesitant step inside, not waiting for him to invite her in. Tom remained still, not offering a word, not even a gesture to tell her to come in. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. Emily didn't need an invitation. She was already here, and he couldn't stop her now. "I didn't know about the trust," she finally whispered, her words coming out in a rush, like she was trying to push them out before they were swallowed by the guilt in her throat. She lowered her eyes, avoiding his gaze as she spoke. "I didn't know it wasn't under your name. I thought it was just yours to sell. I didn't think it through." Tom stood there for a moment staring at her. His hand still gripped the edge of the door, his knuckles white with the pressure. He didn't know what he was supposed to feel. Relief? Sympathy? All he felt was a dull ache in his chest, something that had been there for days, growing heavier with each passing moment. "Because you never asked," he said quietly, the words simple but heavy. They hung in the air between them, the truth of them settling over her like a weight she couldn't shake off. She hadn't asked because she hadn't cared enough to. Or maybe, in her mind, the house had just been a thing to sell, not something that belonged to him, to them. Emily flinched at his words, and for a brief moment, her face twisted in something that almost resembled shame. But it didn't last. She quickly wiped her tears, her face hardening with the same defensive arrogance he had seen in her before. "It's not my fault," she said, her voice rising slightly, a thread of panic seeping into it. "Mark, he was the one who handled everything. He told me it was fine, that it was all in the clear. I trusted him. I thought I was doing what was best for us. He made it sound like everything would be okay." Tom's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Your choices are yours, Emily," he said firmly, the words cutting through the air like a blade. "You made the decision. No one forced you. Not Mark, not anyone. You chose this. And now you have to face the consequences of it." For a moment, Emily seemed to shrink, her defiance faltering just slightly as the weight of his words settled in. But it was fleeting, that moment of vulnerability. She squared her shoulders, her eyes flashing with a mixture of desperation and anger. "I can't lose everything, Dad," she said, her voice shaking now, her plea raw and open. "I've already given up my job. I told them I was leaving. I can't go back to Miami. I've made all these plans, and now everything's falling apart." She took a step toward him, her eyes pleading. "Please, you have to reverse the legal freeze. I need to fix this, please." Tom looked down at her, the tears in her eyes reflecting the same desperation he had seen from Mark. She was caught in something far bigger than herself now, caught in the fallout of her choices, but it didn't change the fact that she had chosen this path. He shook his head slowly, his heart hardening. "No, Emily," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You've made your choices, and you'll have to live with them. I'm not going to undo everything just because you've decided it's too hard." She stood there, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right words to say, to convince him, to make him understand. But there was nothing left to say. Tom stepped back, his hand still resting on the doorframe, his eyes never leaving hers. "You'll find a way to make it right," he said softly, his tone unyielding. "But it won't be because I fixed it for you." Emily stood there for a long moment, her face crumpling in a mix of frustration and regret. But Tom didn't flinch. He didn't waver. He had already made his decision. The door, still slightly ajar, hung between them like the final barrier. And finally, without another word, Emily turned, her shoulders slumped, and walked away. Tom stood in the doorway watching her go, his heart heavy with something he couldn't name. He had always known it would come to this, but that didn't make it any easier. As she disappeared from view, Tom closed the door slowly behind him, the silence settling in once again. But it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence before a storm. The news of Emily's attempted sale spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Charleston's small coastal community, where everyone knew each other's business, had a way of turning personal matters into public spectacles. By the time Tom heard the first whispers, he could already feel the weight of it. The beach house had been more than just property to the people here. It was part of their shared history, a piece of the coast's quiet, enduring legacy. And Emily had tried to sell it off like an old chair at a yard sale. The morning after the legal freeze was filed, Tom made his way to the marina, as he always did. The salty breeze was cool against his skin, the water a calm expanse of blue reflecting the cloudless sky. But there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. People were talking, pointing, and when Harold and Margie, his longtime neighbors, spotted Emily, they didn't hesitate. Emily was by the docks, near the boats, trying to look inconspicuous as she moved toward the small cafe that overlooked the marina. She wasn't dressed for the occasion, her clothes too elegant for the quiet local scene. But even if she had blended in with the crowd, it wouldn't have mattered. People had already made up their minds about her. "Emily!" Harold's voice rang out, sharp and angry, as he and Margie approached. They weren't tall people, but their presence was impossible to ignore. They had been part of the neighborhood for years, and their loyalty was to Tom and to everything that beach house stood for. Emily stopped in her tracks, her body going rigid as she turned to face them. Her face, which had been drawn with exhaustion and worry, flickered with something like guilt, but only for a second before it was replaced by defiance. "Harold, Margie," she said, her voice tight but steady. "What's going on?" Harold didn't mince words. "What's going on?" he repeated, his tone rising in disbelief. "You're selling your father's house, your family's house, without even talking to him first." Emily's face twisted with irritation. "It's not like that," she said, but the words felt weak, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as them. She looked around, clearly uncomfortable. "It was a decision I made with Mark. We need to move forward." Margie, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward, her voice full of grief and fury. "Your mother's ashes were scattered at that beach, Emily," she said, her eyes stinging with tears. "Your father loved that house. Your mother loved it. And you sold it like it was just another piece of property. Do you even know what you're doing?" The words landed with a heavy thud. Emily recoiled, a flush rising to her face as if struck. But she quickly recovered, her expression hardening. "It's just a house," she said dismissively, her eyes flashing with impatience. "I didn't think it would be such a big deal." Harold's face twisted in disbelief. "A big deal? You don't think that house means something to this community? To your father?" He stepped closer, his voice growing quieter but no less intense. "I've known you since you were a child, Emily, but this is a betrayal." Emily's eyes darted away from him, her jaw clenching. The anger that had been simmering in her chest boiled over. "I don't need a lecture from you," she snapped, her voice trembling. "I did what I thought was best. You don't know what it's like to try to make something of yourself when everything is falling apart." With that, she turned sharply and walked away, her steps quick and angry, her shoulders stiff with emotion. She didn't look back, but as she left, Tom saw the briefest flicker of something like regret, but masked by the walls she'd built around herself. From across the marina, hidden behind the boats, Tom watched her leave, his expression unreadable. His heart ached, but his face showed nothing. She was still his daughter, but that didn't change what she had done. The damage had been done, and now it was beyond his reach to fix it. Back at home, the phone calls started coming in. Mark's employer, the one who had supported him through the real estate deals and connections, was distancing himself. "We're not comfortable with the situation, Mark," the voice on the other end had said. "There's too much uncertainty around this deal. I can't risk my reputation." Tom could imagine the expression on Mark's face, the same one he'd seen the first time Emily had brought him around. Charming, sure, but always calculating, always looking for a way to advance, even if it meant stepping on people to get there. And now, Mark's world was starting to collapse, just like Emily's, and she had no one to blame but herself. Emily's social world, too, began to crumble. Calls from friends were ignored. Messages flooded her phone, a mix of anger and disbelief. People she had known for years were pulling away, suddenly questioning her choices. The weight of their disapproval seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud, and with each passing hour, it became harder for Emily to pretend she wasn't feeling it. Tom knew it wasn't over. It wasn't over for Emily or for Mark. The neighborhood would continue to talk, and more people would distance themselves from them, from their mess. But for now, Tom remained silent, a witness to the unraveling of it all. He stayed in the shadows, his thoughts heavier than the weight of his silence. And as Emily's life began to splinter, the one thing Tom knew for sure was that he would remain steady, no matter what. The storm wasn't over. Not yet. The phone call was short, but it carried the weight of everything that had been building for weeks. Mark's voice was cold, sharp with the kind of anger that only comes when someone has nothing left to lose. "This is your fault," he spat at Emily, the words coming through the phone like daggers. "You're incompetent, Emily. You didn't even check the ownership. This whole mess, this disaster, it's on you." There was a long silence, broken only by the harsh sound of Mark's breathing. Emily stood in the living room of their apartment, the phone pressed to her ear, her fingers shaking, her mind racing. She had no words to defend herself, not with him, not with anyone. Every decision she'd made had spiraled out of control. But in Mark's eyes, none of it mattered. The trust, the house, the fraud, it was all a reflection of her failure. "You promised me, Emily," Mark continued, his voice rising. "You told me everything would work out. Everything was supposed to be easy. Now we're stuck in the middle of this, and I'm done." Emily's throat tightened as she tried to respond, but nothing came out. She had been the one to push him, to make the decisions that led them here. She had been the one who had believed the house was just another asset to sell, another step forward in their quest for a better life. But now, with the legal freeze in place, and the trust reasserting control over everything, she could feel the walls closing in. The words that followed were louder, sharper, venomous. "I want a divorce," Mark finally yelled, the words ringing in her ears like the final strike of a bell. "You've destroyed us, Emily. You've ruined everything. You can't even get something simple right." With those words, Emily's knees buckled, and she sank down onto the couch. The phone slipped from her hand and landed on the floor with a dull thud. Her head spun, her chest felt hollow. Divorce. The word echoed in her mind, a threat that had always loomed in the background, but was now staring her dead in the face. She had known their relationship was strained, but this? This felt like a line she couldn't cross back from. She sat in silence for a long time, her mind numb, trying to process the reality of what had just happened. She had pushed so hard for everything. Too hard, maybe. But this wasn't how it was supposed to end. She had a plan. She always had a plan. And now, it was slipping away, crumbling at the edges. But there was still a flicker of defiance in her. Maybe she could still fix this. Maybe she could pull herself out of the wreckage. A few hours later, she stood in front of her father's house, the weight of the world on her shoulders. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the yard. But to Emily, the light felt dim, almost suffocating. She hadn't wanted to come back, not like this, not after everything she had put him through. But there was no other choice. She needed him. She rang the doorbell, her heart hammering in her chest. Rachel answered the door, her face cautious but unreadable. She didn't need to ask why Emily was here. She already knew. "She's inside," Rachel said, stepping aside to let Emily in. The door closed softly behind her, and Emily walked into the house, her footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. Tom was sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in front of him, his face unreadable. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't offer any kind of greeting. The air between them was thick with the distance that had been growing for weeks, months even, and Emily wasn't sure how to cross it. She stood there for a long time, unsure of what to say. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. "I'm losing everything, Dad," she said, the words almost breaking as she said them. She wasn't just talking about the house or the trust or Mark. She was talking about her entire life, the life she had built, the life she had dreamed of. Tom's eyes softened, but his expression remained unchanged. He didn't offer her the comfort she wanted, didn't tell her everything would be okay. He just looked at her, his gaze steady, as if waiting for her to see the truth for herself. "Maybe now you'll see what matters," he said finally, his voice low but firm. There was no anger in it, no bitterness, just a quiet resignation, a sense of finality. He had tried to teach her. He had tried to protect her. But in the end, it had all been her choice. Emily swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. She had come here, desperate for help, desperate for him to fix everything, but deep down, she knew he wouldn't. This was the consequence of her own choices, and there was no turning back now. Rachel stood quietly in the corner, watching them both. Her arms were crossed, her face calm, but Emily could see the faint edge of concern in her eyes. She hadn't wanted to face Tom like this, hadn't wanted to see him watch her break down, but the weight of everything was too much to carry alone. Tom didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words could have been. Emily stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, the realization settling over her like a thick fog. She had lost, and now she had to figure out how to live with it. But for the first time, she wasn't sure if she could. The door creaked open, and Emily stepped into Tom's kitchen, her movements slow, deliberate. She wasn't sure what to expect, wasn't sure what she was hoping for, but standing in front of her father felt like the hardest thing she had ever done. The weight of everything she had lost, everything she had broken, settled heavily on her shoulders. She had come here for one reason, to make it right. But deep down, she feared it was too late for that. Tom was sitting at the table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He didn't look up when she entered. There was no greeting, no invitation. The silence between them stretched out like an impassable chasm, and Emily felt the sting of every moment that had led to this. Rachel stood nearby, her arms crossed, watching them both. Her face was unreadable, but Emily could see the tension in her stance, the guarded look in her eyes. This wasn't just between her and Tom anymore. Rachel was a part of it too, part of the collateral damage in the wake of Emily's mistakes. "I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice trembling, the words almost too quiet to hear. She hadn't expected it to be this hard, hadn't expected the apology to feel like it was being ripped from her chest. But there it was, raw and real. "I know I've hurt you both. I've hurt this family, and I don't know how to make it right." Tom didn't say anything at first. He didn't even move, but Emily could feel his eyes on her now, the weight of his gaze, a quiet accusation. His silence stung more than anything he could have said. "I was selfish," she continued, the words finally spilling out in a rush. "I thought success meant shortcuts. I thought if I just did what Mark said, if I just made the sale, everything would work out. But I was wrong." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "I've been wrong about so many things." The words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain, and for a moment, Emily wasn't sure if her father would even listen. She didn't blame him if he didn't. He had every right to shut her out, to turn away. But she needed him to hear her, needed him to understand that she was trying, that she was finally beginning to see the mess she had created. Tom remained silent for a long moment. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, slowly, he set down the mug of coffee in front of him and looked up at her. His eyes were tired, heavy with years of disappointment and loss, but there was something else in them now, a flicker of something softer, maybe even a trace of hope. "Fix what you broke," he said, his voice low but steady. It wasn't an invitation for excuses. It wasn't a plea for her to make things right. It was a command, a final chance, but only if she could prove she was truly ready to take responsibility. Emily felt a wave of relief flood through her, though it was quickly tempered by the weight of his words. This was it. There was no going back now. She wasn't going to get a second chance. Not from him, not from anyone. If she was going to fix this, it had to be now. "I will," she said, the promise clear in her voice. "I'll fix it. I'll retract the sale, make it right with the buyers, with the community. I'll do whatever it takes." Tom nodded slowly, and though his face remained calm, there was something about the way he looked at her now, a small acknowledgement, maybe even a quiet pride, but there was no forgiveness in his eyes yet. That would take time. Rachel stepped forward, her arms uncrossing as she studied Emily with an unreadable expression. Emily felt her gaze like a weight, and for a moment, she was sure Rachel would turn away too. But then Rachel spoke, her voice cautious, but not unkind. "I'm angry with you, Emily," she said quietly, her words heavy with all the things unsaid. "I'm angry because you didn't care enough about what mattered. You didn't care about Dad, about the house, about any of us. She paused, her eyes softening slightly. But I can't stay angry forever. Rachel's gaze lingered for a moment longer, and then she nodded just slightly. I'll give you a chance, but you have to do it, Emily. You have to show us that you're willing to make things right. Emily swallowed hard, the weight of Rachel's words settling over her. It was the closest thing to forgiveness she had gotten, and it felt like a fragile bridge she wasn't sure she could cross. But it was a start. It was all she had left. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Whitmore, as expected, was ready to act. He worked quickly, drafting the statement that Emily would need to retract the sale. It wasn't going to be easy. It wouldn't undo the damage, but it was a step in the right direction. She had to make it public, to admit to her mistakes, to make sure everyone knew that she was no longer trying to sell what wasn't hers to sell. As the evening grew darker, Emily sat at the kitchen table, her hand trembling as she signed the retraction letter. She glanced up at Tom and Rachel, who stood across the room. There was no forgiveness in the room yet, but there was something else, something like the faintest trace of possibility. But as she pressed the pen to paper, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The screen in front of Emily was blank, the cursor blinking at her with a quiet, unrelenting rhythm. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her chest, a physical sensation that felt like a boulder lodged in her ribs. She hadn't wanted it to come to this, hadn't wanted to make her mistakes so public, but the decision had been made, and now there was no turning back. The house was gone, the sale was over, and the damage had been done. All that was left was to admit it, to make it official. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and for a brief moment, she hesitated. This wasn't just a matter of words. It was an admission of everything she had failed to see, everything she had taken for granted. She had thought she could fix things with money, with quick decisions and ambition. She had been wrong. With a deep breath, Emily began typing, her fingers moving quickly now, the words flowing, almost as if they were being forced out of her. I regret to inform the community that the sale of the Caldwell family beach house has been retracted due to errors in the transaction. I made an irreversible mistake and acted without fully understanding the implications of my actions. I apologize to everyone involved for the confusion and disruption this has caused. I take full responsibility for my decisions and the consequences they have brought. The statement felt like a weight lifting and settling at the same time. It wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough to fix what had been broken, but it was all she could do. She hit send, and the words were out in the world, irreversible now, like everything else she had done. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers trembling. The screen flashed with notifications almost immediately. Messages, likes, comments, some supportive, some angry, but they were all there, making it real. The real estate community, always so quick to react, had already acknowledged her honesty. A few comments praised her for owning up to the mistake, for having the courage to admit the truth. There were others who were less kind, more skeptical, but at least they weren't hiding behind legal jargon. The buyers, too, had posted a public response, expressing appreciation for her transparency and assuring everyone that they were dropping their threats. The deal was over, but at least it was over with some semblance of dignity intact. As she scrolled through the messages, a sharp ping came through from Mark. His response wasn't the polite, businesslike message she had hoped for. It was something far colder, far harsher. Public humiliation, the text began, the capital letters screaming at her through the screen. What the hell were you thinking? I told you this would ruin everything. You didn't need to go this far. You could have just signed the papers and kept your mouth shut. Now everyone knows what a failure you are. You've embarrassed me, embarrassed us, in front of everyone. Emily's stomach churned. She had expected his anger. She had expected this, but still, the sting of his words hit deeper than she'd anticipated. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Mark never cared about the family legacy. He never cared about what that house meant to Tom. He only cared about what he could use, what he could manipulate to make his life easier. Emily had been too blinded by his promises, by the dream of a life that looked perfect on paper. She had thought they were partners. She had thought they were building something together. But now, she saw it. She saw the truth, clear as day. Mark had never cared about her family, about their history. He only cared about himself. Tears burned in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly, pushing the thought to the back of her mind. She couldn't focus on Mark anymore. She had to deal with the fallout, had to face what she had done. It didn't take long for the next text to come in, this time from Emily's boss. She had already given notice at her job, but the message felt like the last nail in the coffin. Emily, it read, "We're sorry, but in light of recent events, we can no longer offer you a position with the company. Your public retraction has created too much uncertainty, and we can't risk the impact on our reputation." Her world felt like it was crumbling around her. The job she had walked away from, the relationship she had believed in, it was all falling apart piece by piece. Emily didn't know what to do next. Her entire world had been built on an illusion, and now she had nothing left. She couldn't stay in this apartment anymore. Not like this. It was too suffocating, too full of memories she could never erase. That evening, she packed a small bag and drove to Tom's house. She hadn't planned to go there, hadn't expected to ask for anything, but she had nowhere else to go. She had already lost everything, and now the only thing she could do was face the consequences of her choices. Tom was sitting at the kitchen table when she arrived, as calm as ever. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her, his expression unreadable. I need to leave, Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I need to get away from all this. I don't know where to go, but I can't stay there." Tom didn't immediately respond. He didn't offer her comfort, didn't tell her everything would be okay. He simply nodded, his gaze steady but distant. He had already made his decision about what Emily needed to do. "Stay as long as you need," he said quietly, "but don't expect me to fix this for you." Emily nodded, the tears threatening to fall again, but she held them back. She wasn't ready to feel sorry for herself. Not yet. And as she settled into the spare room, her mind raced with the reality that she had reached the lowest point of her life. The public apology, the retraction. It had been the first step in trying to make things right, but the truth was, it felt too late. The front door creaked open for the first time in weeks. The silence that greeted Tom felt different now, heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The floorboards beneath his boots groaned in protest as he stepped inside, the familiar smell of salt and old wood filling the air. It was the same house, the same rooms he had walked through countless times, but now, with everything that had happened, it felt like a stranger. He had put off coming back here, avoiding the place that had once been a sanctuary. After the chaos with Emily, the legal battles, the lies, it had all been too much. But today, as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows and bathed the living room in soft light, Tom knew it was time to return. The house wasn't just a building. It was home, or it had been. The air felt thick with nostalgia, heavy with memories of his late wife, of their life here, the summers spent with their children. Tom's fingers brushed along the familiar worn banister as he climbed the stairs, his footsteps slow, deliberate. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed the quiet of this place until now. It wasn't just the house, it was everything it represented, the years of love, of family, of a life built together. As he entered the master bedroom, his eyes fell on the drawers by the bed. Without thinking, he opened one, the wood creaking as it slid. Inside, tucked beneath a few folded shirts, were old photographs, yellowed with age, curling at the edges. He picked one up, his heart tightening as he saw his wife's smiling face, their children's faces still young, carefree. The memories hit him like a wave, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel it. The grief, the love, the weight of the years they had spent here. Rachel had been quietly standing in the doorway, watching him from a distance. She had followed him into the house, knowing he needed this moment, but not wanting to intrude. The years of their shared memories had bonded them in ways she couldn't explain, and now, seeing her father in this place, it was like a silent understanding passed between them. She stepped into the room, moving toward him slowly. "Mom's photos," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Her eyes traced the image in Tom's hand. The same photo that had once sat on their mantel, a reminder of simpler times. Tom didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, his eyes lingering on the photo. After a moment, he carefully placed it back in the drawer, his hand lingering over it for a beat longer than necessary. Then he closed the drawer, the quiet click of the wood snapping him back to the present. "I didn't think I could come back here," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "But I think it's time." Rachel stood beside him now, her hand on his shoulder, offering him the kind of silent support only a daughter could. There was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding, and perhaps a little sadness. They were both caught in the quiet weight of the past when they heard the faint sound of a car pulling up outside. Tom's heart sank. He already knew who it was. He could feel it in his bones. Emily. She hesitated at the doorway, standing just outside, as if unsure whether she should cross the threshold. Her posture was stiff, defensive, but her eyes, those were the eyes of someone broken. Tom didn't say anything at first. He just watched her, his gaze steady but unreadable. It took Emily a moment before she stepped forward, her footsteps slow and tentative, like she was afraid to disturb the fragile peace of the house. When she reached the door, she looked at Tom, her voice quiet. "Dad, She stopped, her words caught in her throat. Tom said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply stepped aside, allowing her inside. He wasn't ready to forgive, but he was ready to let her in. At least for this moment. He couldn't shut her out forever. As Emily stepped into the room, she looked around, taking in the house she had once called home. Her eyes moved over the old furniture, the walls lined with photographs, the memories that seemed to echo in every corner. It didn't take long before she broke down, her shoulders shaking as tears began to fall. I remember the summers here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I remember playing by the water, running around with Rachel. It all feels so far away now." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of her guilt, her regrets, pulling her under. "I didn't know how much this place meant. I thought it was just property. But it's not. It's family. It's us." Tom watched her quietly, the pain of seeing her like this tugging at his heart. It wasn't anger he felt anymore, not even disappointment. It was something deeper, more complex. He could see that she was truly broken, but he couldn't simply wipe away the mess she had made. He couldn't fix it for her. When she finally looked up at him, her face tear-streaked, she whispered, "I'm sorry." Tom let the silence hang between them for a moment before he spoke, his voice low but steady. "This house holds us, not the other way around, Emily," he said, his words simple but full of weight. "It's not about owning it. It's about what it represents, what we've built here, and you've forgotten that." Emily didn't reply. She just nodded, her face buried in her hands, the tears flowing freely now. Tom stood in the doorway, watching her, his expression unreadable. Rachel stood beside him, her hand on his arm, offering her quiet support. Tom didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a small flicker of hope. Perhaps in time, they could rebuild, maybe not the house, but something else, something deeper. But only if Emily could truly understand what she had lost, and what it would take to get it back. The silence in the room stretched on, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid, everything that had yet to be fixed. But as Tom watched Emily slowly pick herself up, he knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. And he knew it wasn't just about the house. It was about rebuilding the trust that had been broken. And that, for Emily, would take time. The apartment was bare now, the remnants of Emily's life with Mark scattered in boxes and half-filled bags. It didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like the end. The finality of it hit her as soon as she started packing, as if every item she folded, every piece of clothing she put away, was another step away from the life she had built with him. But she had no choice. It had to be this way. Mark had already left for the day. It had been one last argument, louder than any of the others, full of accusations and insults, and in the end, Emily had said the words she had never thought she would utter. "I'm leaving." His cold, furious silence had followed, and then the door slammed behind him. Now, as she stuffed clothes into a duffel bag, she felt the weight of what she was leaving behind. Mark had been the dream, the promise of a life of luxury and success, the image of what she thought she wanted. But the truth had become clear. Mark didn't care about her family. He didn't care about her past. He cared about himself, his ambition, his success, his plans. Emily had been a tool in his grand design, and in the end, she was disposable. The doorbell rang, and Emily didn't have to look to know who it was. She had expected Tom and Rachel to show up. They had both been the silent support she'd needed for so long, but now, standing here, with everything packed, she felt like she was breaking their hearts as much as she had broken her own. Rachel stepped into the apartment first, her eyes scanning the room. Her face softened when she saw the half-packed bags, but there was no sympathy in her expression, just the quiet understanding of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Tom followed behind her, his presence calm and steady, as always. "You ready?" Rachel asked, her voice almost too soft. She looked at Emily with the kind of care that only a sister could give. But there was something else there too, something harder, something that told Emily they all knew this wasn't easy. Emily nodded, her throat tight. "Yeah, I'm ready." Tom, standing by the door, didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. He was here to help, not to lecture, not to offer empty words of comfort. He was here because family meant something, and right now, that was all that mattered. As they packed the rest of her things into the car, Emily found herself looking at the apartment one last time. The life she had built, the illusions she had held on to, were now reduced to a few boxes. The apartment, once full of promise and hope, felt empty now. And the emptiness wasn't just in the apartment, it was in her heart. They carried the last of the bags down the stairs. The weight of each step, a reminder of the choices she had made, the mistakes she had tried to ignore. As they loaded the car, Rachel glanced over at her, her expression softening. "Emily," she said, her voice tentative. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Emily hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She had made her choice. She knew it was the right one, but part of her still felt torn. The future she had imagined with Mark was gone, shattered by her own hands. But the future she had now, standing here with Tom and Rachel, felt uncertain, fragile. "I have to," Emily said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I can't live that life anymore. I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not." Tom watched her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he turned, and with his quiet authority, he spoke. "You'll be fine, Emily, but you have to do it on your own." The words weren't harsh, but they were final. They were a reminder that while they would support her, Emily had to take responsibility for what came next. She had to rebuild her life, piece by piece. Once they were in the car, the drive to Tom's house felt long, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken weight. When they arrived, Emily went inside, her movements slow, her mind racing with everything that had happened. She sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched coffee Tom had left for her. "I've never told you everything," she said, her voice low, the words coming slowly, as if they were too heavy to say aloud. "About Mark, about me. I thought if I just pushed forward, I'd get everything I wanted, but I lost myself. And I lost you." Tom sat down across from her, his face impassive, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Emily feel both seen and invisible at the same time. "You should have told me, Emily," Tom said quietly, his voice steady but edged with the truth of it. "But you didn't, and that's on you." "I know," she whispered, the weight of the guilt heavy in her chest. "I'm sorry." There was a long silence. Then Rachel, who had been standing at the window, turned to look at Emily. "We're here now," she said, her voice cautious but soft. "But this isn't going to be easy. We can't fix this for you. You have to do the work." Emily nodded, feeling the tears threaten again. "I will. I'll make it right. I have to." Tom's gaze softened, but his tone didn't waver. "Trust is rebuilt through consistency," he said, the words like a quiet reminder of the long road ahead. And that starts now. Emily looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The silence between them stretched out as she thought about the road ahead. She didn't know how long it would take to rebuild what had been broken, if it could ever be rebuilt. But she knew one thing for sure. She was done running from the consequences of her choices. The question hung in the air like a dark cloud. "Will I ever be part of the trust again?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tom's answer was simple, but it carried the weight of everything she had to prove. "When you earn it." The words settled heavily between them, and Emily nodded slowly. She had a long way to go, but she was determined to make it right, and this time she would do it on her own. The dinner table was set for two. The simple gesture, an invitation extended, a quiet attempt to bridge the gap between them, felt heavier than any words. Tom didn't look at Emily as she entered his house, his movement steady as he poured a glass of wine, the sound of the liquid filling the glass, almost too loud in the stillness of the room. It wasn't about the food, the wine, or even the conversation. It was about something deeper, something unspoken that had been festering between them for far too long. Emily stepped inside, her movements hesitant, but she didn't hesitate when she saw the table. There were no grand gestures, no forced apologies, just a simple invitation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Dinner's ready," Tom said quietly, placing the bottle down and taking his seat without waiting for her. He wasn't going to rush this, not anymore. He had spent so long trying to protect her, trying to shield her from the consequences of her choices. But now, he was done doing that. It was time for Emily to rebuild, to prove she could own her mistakes without needing him to smooth things over. Emily sat across from him, the weight of the silence stretching between them. She had changed, that much was clear. The cocky confidence she once carried like a shield was gone, replaced by something quieter, more reflective. She wasn't trying to hide behind excuses anymore. She wasn't pretending. And for the first time in months, Tom felt like he could breathe in her presence, without the bitterness of betrayal clouding his judgment. "So, how's work?" Tom asked, the question casual, but there was an underlying tone of concern. He had noticed the changes in Emily, how she had started volunteering at a local shelter, spending her days helping others, working at something that demanded humility, something that didn't give her any shortcuts. It was a shift he hadn't expected, but it was the kind of change he could respect. "It's different," Emily replied, her voice softer than usual. She looked down at her plate, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "I've been helping out at the shelter a few days a week. It's not glamorous, but it feels like I'm doing something real, something that matters." Tom nodded, his eyes fixed on her face. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but this was more than he had hoped for. Emily had always been someone who believed in quick fixes, in the kind of success that came from taking the easy route. But now, there was a quiet determination in her eyes, a kind of resolve that made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "You're doing the right thing," Tom said, his voice steady. He took a slow sip of his wine, watching as Emily finally met his eyes. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The past hung in the air, unresolved, but there was a new thread between them, something that felt fragile but real. Rachel, who had been quiet at the edge of the room, watching the two of them, spoke up from where she stood by the kitchen counter. "She's been different, Dad," she said, her voice soft but certain. "I can see it. She's trying." Tom's gaze flicked to Rachel, and for the first time, he saw a hint of approval in her expression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Rachel had always been the protective one, the one who had never fully forgiven Emily for her actions. But now, even she seemed to recognize that something had shifted. Emily looked at Rachel, her face tight with emotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the apology catching in her throat. "I know I can't take back everything I've done. I know I can't undo the hurt I caused, but I'm trying. I'm really trying to make it right." There was a long silence as Rachel nodded, her arms crossed. "I know," she said quietly. "But it's not just about saying sorry. It's about showing us that you've learned." Emily swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. Her eyes welled up, but she quickly wiped away the tears before they could fall. She had learned. It wasn't easy to admit, but she had. She was still learning. But the fact that she was trying, really trying, was the first step. Tom placed his glass down, his expression softening for the first time in weeks. He had heard Emily apologize countless times, each one feeling more like a plea than a genuine effort. But this was different. This time, he felt the sincerity in her voice, in her eyes. She was no longer asking him to fix it. She was doing it on her own, and that was something he could finally believe in. "I believe you," Tom said quietly, his voice steady. "It's not going to be easy, but I believe you." Emily looked up at him, her expression a mix of relief and something deeper, something that had been buried beneath all the pride and the mistakes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The rest of the meal passed in a comfortable silence, the kind that had eluded them for so long. Tom felt something in his chest begin to loosen, a tightness he hadn't realized was there. Emily wasn't fixed, she wasn't perfect, but she was trying, and that was all he could ask for. As they finished dinner, Emily stood to clear the plates. Her movements were slower now, less frantic. When she returned to the table, she met his eyes again, a hint of vulnerability still present, but no longer overshadowed by the arrogance that used to define her. "Thank you," she said again, her voice soft but strong. Tom gave her a small nod, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he stood to finish cleaning up. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were walking it together. And as Emily left that night, the door closing softly behind her, Tom sat back down, watching the empty room with a quiet resolve. She had taken the first step toward healing, and so had he. But the real work, that would come tomorrow. The small brass key sat in Tom's palm, its weight deceptively heavy. It wasn't much to look at, a simple, weathered piece of metal, dull from years of use. But to Emily, it felt like everything. The key to something she had spent so long trying to understand, to earn. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching him, her heart pounding in her chest. Tom didn't look up as he reached for the drawer on his desk, his movements slow but deliberate. He pulled out a small wooden box, nothing fancy, just a box that had seen better days. His fingers brushed across it for a moment, then lifted the lid, revealing the key inside. It was an heirloom, something that had been passed down through generations, its history long forgotten by most, but still holding a significance that only Tom truly understood. He handed it to Emily without a word, his eyes fixed on the worn surface of the table in front of him. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. There was a quiet weight to it, a heavy understanding that lingered in the space between them. Emily took the key slowly, almost reverently, her fingers trembling as she turned it over in her hand. "This doesn't open the house," Tom said, his voice low but steady. "It opens responsibility." The words struck her like a blow, the meaning of them sinking deep into her chest. She had come here, looking for forgiveness, seeking to rebuild the pieces of her life that had shattered under the weight of her mistakes. But Tom wasn't offering her an easy fix. He wasn't offering her absolution. He was offering her something much more difficult, a chance to rebuild not just the house, but herself. Emily looked down at the key, the brass catching the light as it reflected off her hand. The weight of it felt like a promise, like something far heavier than its physical form. It was a symbol, a challenge, and a reminder of everything she had lost. It wasn't just about ownership. It was about trust, the trust that had been broken, the trust she would need to earn back. She swallowed hard, feeling the sting of tears welling up in her eyes. Her throat tightened as she finally whispered, "I understand." Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away from the key. "I'll rebuild. I'll do what I can." Rachel, who had been standing in the corner, watching quietly, stepped forward then. Her eyes met Emily's with a mixture of cautious approval and something softer, a subtle recognition of the change she had seen in her. Rachel hadn't been quick to forgive. She had watched her sister struggle and watched her make mistake after mistake. But this was different. Emily had stopped trying to fix things with empty promises. She was trying to fix them with her actions. Tom watched the exchange between his daughters, the quiet understanding that passed between them. He wasn't a man of many words, but in that moment, there was no need for anything more. He had given Emily the key, not just to the house, but to herself. The responsibility that came with it was hers alone to bear. He nodded slowly, as if to himself. "You're rebuilding, Emily. Keep going," he said, the words simple but full of weight. He didn't need to say more. He didn't need to comfort her. The road ahead was hers to walk, and he wasn't going to do it for her. But he had given her the first step. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, her chest tight with a mix of gratitude and determination. She had been given a chance, one that she hadn't expected, and now she was going to make sure she didn't squander it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. She walked over to Tom, her movements slow, deliberate. For a moment, they just stood there, locked in a silent exchange. And then, without another word, Emily stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a moment of dramatic reconciliation. It was simply a quiet acknowledgement of the trust that was slowly being rebuilt between them. Tom stood still for a moment, his arms at his sides. He didn't embrace her back, but he didn't pull away either. His eyes were steady, his expression unreadable. This wasn't a moment of healing, not yet, but it was a step. Finally, Emily pulled away, her eyes red but resolute. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Tom gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't need to say anything. The weight of the key in her hand, the promise it represented, was enough. As Emily left the house later that night, her fingers still wrapped around the key, she didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, she felt like she had a chance. She had something to work toward. Something real. But as she walked down the path away from Tom's house, the key heavy in her pocket, the question lingered. Could she truly rebuild, or was this just another step in a never-ending cycle of mistakes? The office was quiet when Tom signed the final document, the scratch of his pen against the paper, the only sound breaking the silence. Whitmore stood across the desk, watching him with a quiet intensity, his face unreadable, but not unfriendly. It had been months since the chaos had started, months since Emily's rash decisions had set everything into motion. But now, here they were, at the final step, the culmination of all the waiting, the rebuilding, the silent battles fought in the spaces between words. Tom put the pen down, his hand still lingering over the paper for a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't just about the trust. It wasn't just about ownership of a house. It was about everything that had happened, everything they had lost, and everything they had regained. The house, the beach house, was just a symbol now. What mattered was that his family was still here, still fighting, still trying. "This is it," Whitmore said, his voice quiet but certain. "The trust is updated. Rachel's fully included. Emily, provisionally. With conditions, of course." Tom nodded, his gaze fixed on the document in front of him. Rachel, the steady, unwavering pillar in their family, had always been included. She was a natural part of the trust, a natural part of the legacy that Tom had built over the years. But Emily, she had been the wild card, the one who had broken the trust in the first place, who had shattered their foundation with her impulsive choices. Now, she was part of it again, but only if she proved she could be trusted. Only if she followed through on her commitment to rebuild. "Provisional," Tom murmured to himself, the word carrying a weight that settled in his chest. It wasn't a full return, it wasn't a clean slate, but it was a start. It was something. Whitmore smiled faintly, a rare expression for him, but there was a certain respect in his eyes as he looked at Tom. "You're a fair man, Tom," he said quietly. "You've given her the opportunity to make things right. That's all you can do." Tom didn't respond right away. He wasn't looking for validation. He wasn't even looking for forgiveness. But he knew Whitmore was right. He had done what he could to give Emily a chance, one that deep down, she had to take on her own terms. The weight of the decision lingered in the air as Tom slowly stood up from the desk. He walked over to the window and looked out at the ocean, his eyes scanning the waves as they crashed against the shore. The view had always been a constant, a reminder of the passage of time, of the cycles of life that continued whether they were ready for them or not. It was fitting, in a way, that he should be here now, looking at the vast expanse of water, watching the tides move in and out. The world was always changing. People, too. Life's tides change, Tom said softly, more to himself than to Whitmore. Family should rise with it. Whitmore didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. They both understood what Tom meant. The tides of life were unpredictable, relentless. They could erode everything you built or bring new things to the surface. And just like the tides, family had to change too. They had to adapt, to grow, or they would be swept away with the current. As Tom turned back to face the room, he saw Rachel standing at the door. She had been waiting silently, as she always did, her expression calm, but there was something in her eyes now, a quiet sense of approval, a sense that things were finally moving in the right direction. Emily had been through hell and back, but Tom could see it now. She was different. She was finally starting to understand. Rachel stepped forward, her eyes meeting his, and she nodded toward the door. "She's outside," she said quietly. Emily had been waiting in the yard, pacing, her nervous energy palpable. She had come a long way, but there was still something tentative in her movements, a hesitation that wasn't quite gone. Tom walked past Rachel, his feet heavy on the floor, the familiar creak of the wood underfoot grounding him in the moment. He opened the door to the backyard and stepped outside. Emily stood at the water's edge, staring out at the horizon. The wind tousled her hair, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, loud in the otherwise quiet space. Tom didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. Emily turned slowly as he approached, her face softening when she saw him. She didn't say anything either. Words felt unnecessary after everything they had been through. Rachel joined them a moment later, standing beside Tom, her gaze fixed on Emily. The three of them stood in silence, watching the water, the sound of the waves blending with the soft rustle of the wind in the trees. It was the first time in a long while that they felt like a family again, repaired, but not completely healed. Still, standing there together, it felt like something had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. Emily took a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. She didn't need to explain. Tom could see it in her eyes, in the way she stood there now, a little taller, a little more confident. She had earned this moment. Tom nodded, his face unreadable. He didn't need to say anything. The silence spoke volumes. As Emily stepped closer to the water, Rachel by her side, Tom took one last look at the ocean, feeling the pull of its depths, knowing that, like the tide, things would continue to change. But for now, they were standing together, restored, but wiser. And as Emily glanced back at him, a flicker of understanding passing between them, Tom knew that no matter how much time passed, they would always rise with the tides.